everybody. Here we are. DebateSensei, Wednesday. We got Tim Seavey, Bizolutions. We got Jared Kabiga Miller, debate coach, professor. I don't know what happened with Matt. I asked if he was coming tonight, and all he responded with was, "I hate dogs."
Yeah, it was kind of messed up.
I'm like, okay, that makes you a horrible person, but you could still join us for it. He's like, no, I hate dogs so much that I can't come tonight.
You know, there's hate in your heart.
We just don't need that energy.
I don't need that energy either.
Speaking of energy, what do you think about that? All right.
That was a transition.
Yeah. Nice segue. So we're talking about green energy. Now, why is that? So on these first Wednesdays, what we like to do is we like to, talk about issues that you are likely to see in a limited preparation debate round, like parliamentary debate, especially like NPDA. But it also carries over to some other limited preparation debates. Oh, is my?
No, you're good.
Okay. It's giving me a little signal here, so hopefully it holds up. Anyways, so yeah, man, I remember when I first started. Yeah, when I first started, and like climate change was a new thing. It was totally new. This is like Al Gore going around giving his PowerPoint presentation type stuff, and so back then, even then, people were kind of like, I don't know if I believe the science or anything like that. But here we go, like 20 years on, and yeah,
still not that legit. Still probably not correct. Probably not. It was 78 degrees on December 1st today. So,
my God, no, I know.
Feels like a myth to me.
Oh man, who's that? Jim Inhofe, I think it was some senator or something, like brought a snowball into the House of Representatives or the Senate. He's like, well, this disproves climate change. Thank goodness for that. It's like because it snowed in January. I'm like,
scientician right there.
Yeah.
So common cases or topics like this come up all the time. Like I think it's a very regular resolution, like this house will invest in green technology or pass some particular bill that already deals with it. And I think that it ends up being this magic wand oftentimes that affirmative teams will wave of like, we invest in green tech and climate change is solved. Like they'll paint this really, scary picture because there's a ton of evidence out there, tons of link stories about like where climate change is impacting lives in the short term, long term. And like, here's climate scientists that say that we're doomed by whatever date. And like, there's some squabbling over what the date is, but it ends up being the case. Like, all right, we invest $1 billion in solar and then everything's solved. And like, lives are saved and the planet's perfect and everything is fine. And obviously like there are so many more steps in that process that are missed. But that said, there are also some rounds that people do their homework on a couple of different pieces of green technology and can actually give some more reasonable, tangible, probable impacts of like, we can reduce our reliance on coal by 500,000 tons by 2025 or whatever. Like, cool, that sounds pretty good to me. And then they can do all the math on like for every ton of CO2 release, like that changes whatever. So I like when some of that math is done, or at least like people find some sources that give a little bit of detail in breaking it down. Like the science topics get tricky, and I think unfortunately it's too easy just to like wash away any of the impacts or assume like because we've done this thing that has upside potential, it solves all problems. So I really like the details that are maybe lower magnitude but higher probability in green tech rounds.
Yeah, and so I had a coach one time. I hope I'm remembering this right, but this is how I remember it. Is where on these topics you want to be careful that your harms don't overwhelm your solvency. All right, and so like you put out these giant freaking earth-shattering apocalyptic harms, and then you're kind of like, all right, and so we're just gonna we're gonna do wave generator power plants along the West Coast, and it's kind of like, and that's it. And he's kind of like, you have these things that are global catastrophes, and you have these really, really regional, inefficient solutions. And then you're like, well, as long as it's carbon neutral, we win. He's like, no, like you just said that if we don't get it below a certain amount, like we all die. Does this get below that certain amount or not? And the answer is it doesn't.
Step 3, profits.
Yeah. So I'm very sympathetic to those negative teams that point that out. You know what I mean? Like if you were in a critical writing class and you turned in that essay, I mean, I'm sure you could probably get a pretty good grade on it. But that, I don't know. If I'm grading that, I'm like, that's a pretty glaring oversight. You know what I mean? It's like you got to have something that's sort of commensurate with the magnitude that you're talking about in the harms.
And I think it's easy to find a ton of data, and so it's easy when like doing quick research to tell a harm story that is gigantic and it's dramatic. Like it certainly gets the attention of a judge, and it feels like we're going to really be superheroes there. But that's where it doesn't take these like super powerful counter plans that are even more nuanced and more scientific and more overwhelming. There seems to be this like race to come up with something cooler, when in actuality it can be just like a very rational solvency breakdown of like, they don't get there. They don't solve these things, even if they solve a tiny bit. I think what I most frequently see in earlier like novice junior rounds is the government team being like, try or die, at least we do something.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really, unfortunately, bad argument. Like doing something in the face of a tidal wave, like, great, you built a sandcastle. It doesn't actually really, make anything better. And I know that that's a common line that coaches will give to affirmative teams is like, well, hey, at least you're doing something versus the other team that's not doing anything at all. And that becomes like a really strong selling point in like, rebuttal speeches that I'll see, PMs give. And I really don't think that goes as far. So what I would love to do, if we can talk about a couple different types of green tech, what their benefits and drawbacks are, and like if we've seen any cool cases that relate to those pieces of tech. So for example, one of the ones that I've seen is a like carbon recapture case where they're like, nothing that we can possibly do can actually solve global warming with the exclusive exception of capturing carbon. Like we have to be able to trap it, right? Because for every like forest that burns, not only is that like decreasing the carbon recapture of those trees and oxygen production, but it's actually burning all of that carbon that was built up in the trees. So like, forests are a really powerful tool for all that stuff, right? So they say like, we're not going to do any new technology stuff. We are going to just plant a ridiculous number of trees. And there's a really cool case for it too, like that it ends up impacting ecosystems and having all kinds of, auxiliary benefits. There's a cool case called colloquially the Forest Man of India. So I think it was like the New Yorker or something, like profiled this dude, like a single dude in India that over the course of 20 years continued to plant more trees in an area that was deforested. And after 10 years, you start to see these like bird species and like other smaller plants and things start to come back. And after like 20 years, so they profiled this over a long period of time, there were elephants that actually had come back to this part of the forest that previously were like knocked down. It was crazy because he would just like use these really slow but effective methods of like, oh, elephants are all about banana trees. So I planted a bunch of banana trees and look, elephants came back to this part of the forest because previously they were like displaced out of here. So really cool stuff. I like those kinds of cases that are not some new, fancy shiny technology, but instead are just like fairly common sense of like what one tree captures back in.
Yeah. And so the thing is, the carbon recapture is really great conceptually. But usually what happens is that people, they get their eyes glaze over with all the razzle dazzle of these concepts, and you don't look into how it's actually being used. And so like carbon recapture technology, or at least like laws, a lot of it actually benefits this thing called OER, which is enhanced oil recovery. So that's carbon capture. So like, whereas oil is really difficult to get. And so you're kind of like, oh, let's get it so it's not out in the environment. And so that falls under this carbon recapture sort of umbrella. And so it's like there's something out there about like how like 80% of carbon capture is OER.
Huh. Oh God.
EOR. Sorry. Yeah.
So that doesn't do anything to displace emissions.
Right. I mean, it's like, you know, like oil sands, you know what I mean? Like where
Okay.
used to be really, really cost prohibitive to do stuff like that. But now it's kind of like, oh, well, look, there is carbon in the atmosphere. We could capture it.
Huh.
So, oh,
That's a
man.
bummer.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, like, you know, like the road to hell paved in good intentions type of things. Like, it's hard to define carbon capture without energy companies sort of co-opting it and using it for just ways to benefit. And you know, even carbon capture, like there's some technologies that literally pull plastic out of the air, and you know what they do with that plastic? They fucking sell it to manufacturers. You know?
Sure. Sweet.
Yeah.
Thank God we solved that one.
Yeah. So I mean, it's like if you're on the neg, I think a lot of the today I want to talk about how do you be neg on these things. I think that the app is kind of like straightforward. You know what I mean? And I think like on the neg you get like how do you do that stuff? Look a little deeper into how carbon capture actually works in real life. It's kind of like recycling is a great concept.
Sure.
But in reality, the way that we execute recycling programs isn't all that great. It doesn't have all the benefits that we say that it does and stuff like that. So, yeah.
Yeah, and that's one that ends up with, in my opinion, starts to get into like panda territory, right? We're like, no, we're saving this animal. Like, it's a worthless animal. Like we're investing in like we're recycling plastic. Like, and then what are you doing with it? You're making more plastic, which then in turn gets thrown away more. Like, and also we're really, really bad at recycling plastic. So even if like we set that as our grand ultimate goals, like recycle more plastic, we only end up recycling a portion of the plastic that we capture. So we're just like filling up landfills, like taking the garbage from one place and putting it into a different place. Not actually like really solving that. I heard a really interesting case. It started with the company. I don't know if you've seen like in gas stations or whatever. It's the big size cans of the company's called Liquid Death. And it's just water. And I was like, what the hell is this company? Like, why is their water Liquid Death? Their entire ethos is really funny. Like the founder like commissioned a metal song to be made just for this thing. Like all their advertising interesting, but it's all in the vein of kill plastic because we're apparently extremely good. Like we're super efficient at recycling aluminum. Like we don't need to mine more aluminum. We already have like 98% of the aluminum that we will ever need. Like currently in function. We're just not recycling enough of it, but we're super good at it. Meanwhile, we really suck at recycling plastic. But people think like, oh, you know, it's the same thing. So I'll just get the plastic bottle, whatever. It doesn't make a difference, but it does. So their idea is like, just move all fluid into cans, like aluminum cans. And like, hey, there's our, you know, cheap, easy bottling problem solved.
Yeah.
So interesting cases and directions like that. I think
if somebody's coming up with carbon capture stuff, like try to, if you have the opportunity to look a little deeper into how it actually goes, then like there's some dirty stuff in there. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It just kind of gets co-opted and stuff. As much as any of environmental goals, you know what I mean? It's like,
sure.
I mean, like energy companies.
I heard a really good one just on Monday, actually. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying that energy companies are really well funded. They got really smart people that know how to read laws and you know, like just kind of fit into all the cracks. It's like water on pavement. They could find every little crack and crevice to fit themselves into. Yeah.
And that's where I think you just have to tell the story. I think is less about like, let's build up the boogeyman or like the real serious issue of like climate change. And instead like the issue is the profitability of really nasty energy production.
Yeah.
Like as soon as it is profitable to go hard on solar or, you know, hydroelectric or air, wind or whatever, like as soon as that is actually profitable, then like scale will win out. And so those things are growing in efficiency and they're becoming more valuable, but it takes like this sort of tipping point of like, so long as it is way more profitable, the whatever like energy unit, so like the joule per pound or whatever, however they measure the energy potential of materials, And burning oil is just a hell of a lot cheaper and more profitable because we've got, a lot of systems in place for it. So I think like there's a lot more of an economics argument just in like supply, demand, and like current capabilities rather than just like, hey, look, this is more efficient. Like, yes, it's more efficient. And how do you make it mainstream? So I saw a really good argument just this week about emissions. So the topic, if it comes up about like, hey, we're going to be able to cut emissions by like 80% or something, doing significant emissions cuts tends to actually have a long-term, it seems like a benefit, but a short-term screws any like potential benefit out of it. And so what the argument is called is the SO2 screw effect.
Oh,
so
yeah.
the explanation is like, in short, whenever you cut emissions, like, so say we were to just tomorrow, we flip a switch and cut all, car emissions, call it. Those emissions are CO2, which is a really bad greenhouse gas, and SO2, that is another, gas that much more quickly, dissipates. But SO2 in the atmosphere actually reflects heat back out of the atmosphere. So it reflects it back out through the ozone layer versus CO2 keeps it in, kind of like the, hot car on a warm summer day, like the warmth stays in there. So the thing is, if you cut emissions, you're actually also cutting SO2 that helps reflect the light back out, but CO2 stays around a lot longer. So it's that whole argument of like, without carbon recapture, cutting emissions doesn't do anything, and the SO2 screw effect actually speeds up the process of warming. So for every amount of emissions you cut, the hotter it gets faster because SO2 is no longer there to help with the process, which is insane.
I think our viewers might need to look into that. I heard the SO2 screw. It was a different argument. I don't want to go down that rabbit trail too much, but it was how like SO2 and CO2 are like kind of cancel each other out.
Yeah.
Like on a chemical level. And so like that less CO2 actually means more SO2. So
okay. I heard the opposite.
Yeah.
Well,
I know. And now I'm confused. Because I ain't a chemist. I ain't a climatologist. You know what I mean? It's like, and so that requires a bit more research than we have at our fingertips right now.
So a good neg strategy, research the SO2 screw effect. And I think it's an effective argument just to like throw back at basic, poorly researched or under explained plans that are just like, we're going to cut emissions by this way. Like, okay, and here's why that's actually worse. Now, I will say there is still something to the performance, like the pathos of we are doing something, and the neg side just saying, yeah, it's not good enough. While you can still win debates that way, and like rightfully so, you shouldn't pass bad plans just because it's doing something. I still think that there's some value to having something of a solution in place. So I would still recommend like have a counter plan, even if it is small, that does something you can actually measure or quantify. So a lot of your position on the negative side can be like the affirmative side doesn't really think through where this goes. It doesn't solve big enough or doesn't do enough, where you can have a much more small, even if it's less dramatic or less exciting, it still does something. So like, planting more trees, or like I've seen a ton of stuff with like phytoplankton, like that the vast majority of oxygen production in the world comes from phytoplankton and not from trees. And so like if we need to do this offsetting with oxygen and CO2 or whatever like consumption, then plankton can do a ton. And then it can be used for bioenergy and stuff like that. So I've heard some interesting cases in those directions, but just I think if I'm on the negative side, I'm going to be looking for what's the most likely real detriment that comes from common green tech.
Yeah, it's really, really hard coming up with competitive counterplans because they're just kind of like, yeah, that's a really awesome other thing that we should also do on top of what we were talking about. And so finding like really competitive counterplans, I think is difficult. So you have to exclude certain technology. If they're saying like, okay, we need solar, then you have to say, okay, well, there's you have to back them into a corner about what type of solar that they're doing, and then like I don't know, exclude something, or man, I don't know. It becomes really tough because usually, like we said, usually what they do is have a really, really small amount of solvency for a really, really large amount of harms. And so when you offer a counterplan, all that does is add to solvency.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It really sucks.
Yeah. Sometimes like you can get away with arguments like So if the government side is going really big in for solar, right? Like you can sometimes get away with the mining process for photovoltaic cells is super, super toxic.
Yeah,
They are not recyclable, and like at absolute best, they're like 20% efficient. So like they are, can capture like 20% of the potential energy of sunlight. And yet like they're terrible. They don't last very long. They tend to break. All kinds of little things can make them, completely useless. Basically, they're like functionless. So like a cloudy day, and now you don't have power. So there's like all kinds of issues with solar. But I would probably go for like the environmental degradation route of it, of like picking something that is environmentally toxic to help solve an environmental problem is like a completely counterintuitive or a nonsensical argument, or like a self-defeating argument, and therefore go with our plan that has no environmental negative impact. It's tough because it's like you don't do a good plan and a bad plan is never a super convincing mutually exclusive argument.
yeah. So I think this is, and you just touched upon something where if they say like do solar, that's where you could use the magnitude of the harms. It's like, okay, in order for us to actually solve global warming, this is the amount of solar you need in order to solve it, right? And then you say the amount of land that you have to set aside for solar panel like power plants is ridiculous. And then you just talk about the land use. It's like a lot of them are out in the desert, right? And everyone's like, well, nobody cares about the desert. You're like, well, a lot of creatures care about the desert. They live there, and so there's and you just talk about how like there's it's not a zero impact thing on solar. So you're like, okay, we have to use this amount of solar in order to solve the problems that you said, and now you're backing them into this like sort of double screw, right? It's kind of like either you take up a bunch of land in order to do your solar plan and solve for climate change, or you don't, and we're screwed. You know what I mean? It's kind of like, and so it's yeah. So like when they're talking green technology, if they don't do the extrapolation of how much they need to do in order to solve it, you should do it on the neg. I think that'll really back them into a corner. They're like, well, we're not talking about that much land. It's like, well, then you're talking about death from climate change.
You bring up a good point, actually, and it's something that's back from the good old days of points of information. That's a really good point of information that now just should be like the first question in flex time. It's like, question for you. How much fill in the blank of your green tech do you need to offset these things?
Yeah.
Asking those questions are really rhetorically powerful and set up better arguments going into it. I think like that's a topic area that's current, or that's, I guess, a utility that's currently under exploited in Parley, at least that I see. Like oftentimes Flex is used a lot to like prep things, and like there's some questions that come out of it. But I think that's a great time to just start getting some of these like really damning questions out there in the open. Whether the other times, team can solve them or not, like it sets up the stage for a more conservative but realistic LOR or LOC that like here's what we can actually do, and here's why your plan is not even worth attempting.
Yeah, similarly, you could ask where they are putting these power sources. So, like, geothermal is a very popular sort of, because it's like totally carbon neutral and stuff like that. Very little sort of downside. But the only places where it's actually viable to do these things are like in the middle of nowhere. And in order to do that, you have to run cable from those power plants to where these centers are. And you lose electricity for every mile of cable that you got. Okay. It's not like you get the same amount of energy 50 miles away from the power plant that you do 1 mile away. All right. And so that inefficiency eventually is, and so you either, so again, like it's a double screw. You're saying, oh, we're going to do it in the middle of the desert. It's like, well, there's not a lot of people that live in the middle of the desert. So you're losing, like, first off, it's inefficient. And secondly, you're losing power from that inefficient source if it's solar. But the same thing with, geothermal. It's like there's only certain areas in the world where it works, and the amount of energy that we get from it is lost by and large because of how far away people live from those sources. And so I think that bringing it down to reality, right? The more real you get on the negative, Like there's a reason why this hasn't been solved, people. And it's not just greed. It's not just greed. That's a big part. Don't get me wrong, okay? But there's a reason why. It's because this is hard to solve. It's like an impossible math problem that you just got to point out the variables. It's kind of like, yeah, you're not fixing this. There's a reason why it's not been solved.
Yeah. You remind me on the geothermal point, just because it's always an awesome case to bring up, the caldera. I just any chance to ever bring up that case is so freaking cool.
Great.
You explained that to me one time, and was it Yellowstone?
Yellowstone.
Okay, so what's the basis of that? Like, I know that there's not a lot of people that live near Yellowstone, so you would have all the disadvantages about, like, attenuation over wire and losing power. But it's still a cool argument just because it has a cool advantage. What's Cool Caldera?
Cool Caldera. So Yellowstone is a super caldera that and it has basically erupted on a pretty regular schedule of and now I forget the exact timeline, but I think it's like 60,000 years, every 60,000 years or something. There's just some massive eruption, right? And we're talking way worse than any volcano, but it's big old hot spot under the surface. It keeps on building, and eventually it blows. Well, it's been about 60,000 years since the last time that thing blew, or it's been whatever the time interval is. All I remember is that right now we're at that time interval, and so actually putting geothermal plants in there would mean that we're siphoning the heat off of the caldera, because the way geothermal works is that you use the heat in order to move turbines with steam and stuff like that. And so when you're doing that, what you're doing is basically cooling the caldera, and you're decreasing the chance that it will explode. And that's the reason why that's so like awesome from a debate perspective, is that everyone thinks you're going for the climate change advantage. But if you're saying you're trying to avoid apocalypse from eruption, it's a curveball. It's a curveball. You know what I mean? And it's like, yeah. And so that's fun. I don't know. That's fun for debate dorks.
Yeah, I think like extinction scenarios is like one of the favorite pastimes. Like just discussing the probability of various extinction scenarios is like the favorite discussion of rebuttals. Like, well, how likely is it that you get to this or that or whatever different extinction? And like, here's one that we don't talk about a lot. We all die from a volcano. What are you doing to fix that with your plan? Like, how does your solar solve the likelihood that we all die from a volcano?
Yeah.
Right? Like,
yeah. So that's, yeah, that's a really good one for like the alternative. So that's what I was saying, that you have to do the hard work on the counter plan. You have to run a disadvantage. It can't just be mutually exclusive. Like you're saying, you're right. We could do both of these, but the solar panels and with the silver mining disadvantage, silver mining does not link to geothermal energy.
Sure.
It does link to solar panels. And so now you have a comparative advantage. And let's be honest, I think most counterplan debates, like if we're being honest, really come down to comparative advantage, not mutual exclusivity, right?
Yeah, that's true. Like, I mean, unless it's a pick or something that is a popular direction that is taken, I think that we like instruct debaters to go for it has to be mutually exclusive. Like it has to be time frame or funding, like some other means of impossible to do both. But in reality, like a well justified comparative advantage, I think, can still be just as easy to win. Like, I don't think that I see teams win on really well refuted perms. Oftentimes, like they win on a perm that's like the other side just said like, well, no, don't do it because we have a better idea than them. Like they don't get it's our ground or whatever. Like that, just poorly refuted perms tend to win, but I think well refuted perms don't. So I think that's kind of a useful area to go into it with, is just the confidence in a comparative advantage.
Okay, I got to, before we take off, I got to put in a little bit of stuff about wind energy. You know what I mean? And like, so, because I think, first off, it is underutilized. Like, man, you could put in a bunch of wind turbines off the coast of everywhere. You know what I mean? Just, and like, there's just
the expected cost is supposed to be like dropping by like 50% per year. Like the cost of doing it is ridiculously cheap. So getting into the probability side of it, like I was talking about before, like it needs to be profitable for companies to invest in it.
Right.
Like offshore wind is pretty dang high.
Yeah, it's getting there. It's getting there. Now, the real reason I want to talk about it is like one of my favorite arguments that I used to make if somebody was doing wind was about migratory birds and how like they killed migratory birds because they ran into the propellers. Okay, here's the thing. That really isn't all that true. Like,
Really?
yeah.
Okay.
It's like, that was not like that was based on not the best sort of science techniques, you know what I mean, about data collection and stuff like that. So at the very, very least, there is evidence that directly refutes the bird argument. All right, just to let everyone out there know, it is not a guarantee that wind turbines kill migratory birds. And when you think about it for half a second, it kind of makes sense that birds know how to avoid fucking giant slow moving turbines. I mean, like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
They can evade other birds trying to attack them. I think another bird chasing them is a hell of a lot more difficult to like get away from than just a very consistently spinning thing. And even still, I think you're going to end up outweighing on all kinds of things. Like I've never found that argument super compelling. It always like makes me chuckle a little bit. It's like, oh, that's a bummer, poor birds. But like it doesn't feel all that impactful.
Even if you grant the impact, you're kind of like, okay, sorry, birds are dying.
Like
they're going to die a lot more.
Plan that doesn't have some kind of environmental downside to it. Like you have to take trucks into an area to plant trees, or like you have to walk into it, whatever, and like you step on foliage, whatever. Like there's a million little arguments that can come out of that. So yeah, wind I think is a useful one to go in that direction. I think it just comes down to like arguments of inefficiency, which kind of brings us full circle of don't paint a harms picture that you can't solve.
Right. Rapid fire. Any other, like, I know wave generators, we used to love to run that, and that science has not been really well established. What else? Green
shake
technology.
Weights. That's a good one. Just humans using shake weights. It'll generate enough power. So hydroelectric, I've heard good arguments on like it is somehow the most inefficient still form, but it kills a ton of fish. So like a job of every dam is to have like basically like a chum collector. And it's like some of the stories have like a pretty good visual to them. Like you can tell the stories where like they'll talk about the number of thousands of pounds of fish they have to like dig out of these things. So like that's pretty bad. Like there's, I'll say it's more impactful than the bird argument is to wind.
But there's also a limit to how many dams you can build. And we've already built quite a bit. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's a really good disadvantage to that one is China. They recently broke ground on a dam to the last flowing part of the Yellow River. And like there is no longer any like free flowing part of the Yellow River. And so like the number of migratory fish and the number of like even humans that like lived along its banks, like the number of displacement and like pollution now that is caused by once flowing water that is now stagnant is horrible because there is such tremendous financial benefit to damming rivers in China.
I think that hydroelectric is really susceptible to an environmental racism critique because you're not going to dam up any place where rich people live. You know what I mean? It's like, and any time that you dam up a river, you have to tell the people that live on the banks of that river to move. And so, you know, I mean, that's the whole plot line to Deliverance. And so, you know, and Deliverance was not a bunch of rich people.
That's a good argument too. So yeah, I think hydro, terrible argument to go for. Clean coal doesn't exist. Setting the record straight.
That's not real, everybody. So that's all we'll say about that since we're
I mean, nuclear is always a really fun direction to go in. I think you have like endless, boundless fun arguments to have in that subject. It is not renewable though, so be careful the wording of the resolution.
Yeah, it's just so damn efficient that you're right. It's not renewable, but I don't care.
So that's where if the argument comes down to renewable, if the resolution says renewable energy, definitely topicality the hell out of a government team that uses nuclear, and then on top of that, run a counter plan that is nuclear with all of the same advantages, and be like, look, this is by definition neg ground, and just go hard for that one. Because would you count it as green tech? I guess I probably would.
I really appreciate the debate about that. I'll be honest with you. I'm sure there's people that are just like hate that idea, but even things that are incredibly dangerous, I think we shouldn't just bury it underground. That we should head with, like, we are aware of nuclear technology. We should approach it like adults, and that's how I kind of think that a good approach is for it. But I really do appreciate the other side as well, where it's kind of like, yeah, it's not green tech. I mean, like, radiation's horrible. The mining of uranium and stuff like that is, I can't think of a worse method for, like, just how rare it is, how much earth you have to move in order to get enough, uranium for it. So stuff like that is like, yeah, I get that.
And like even just like waste transport and waste storage and disposal, like those arguments get super, super hot politically. Even if they don't seem like it's that big of a deal, it still is something that every truly renewable energy source doesn't have to deal with. So like there's good disadvantages to that.
Yeah, I think one of the things about nuclear energy is I love the fact that it's very debatable. Because the thing,
I like that too.
It's proven how efficient it is. That's one thing. It's like, it has proven efficiency, you know what I mean? Yeah. But it's also got some significant disadvantages to it. So when you're talking about the magnitude of benefits to disadvantages, I'm like, man, that's just one of the great sort of like real world examples of risk reward sort of calculus that you have to work out. It's tough. All right, everyone. Hey, I think that's our time. So we got Tim and Jared for DebateSensei. We'll be back next week for a couple more weeks before we take a break. We'll see you later.